Hi, thanks for joining our webinar today. My name's Claire Visser and I'm Head of Business Development at Interserve. I think it's fair to say for most of us, the conversations around workplace and employee wellbeing are really hot topics at the moment. You've only got to have a look at conversations on LinkedIn, social media, trade press. And I thought it'd be useful today to talk with Iain Shorthose, who is our Director of Customer Experience and Workplace, to actually understand some of the conversations that Iain's having with our customers, right across public and private sector, and some of the insights that he can share with us. So hi Iain, thanks for joining us today, really appreciate it. And over to you.
Yeah, I think you've positioned it perfectly, Claire. And I guess that the first point is these aren't new conversations. Workplace and well-being have been front of mind for a long time. But I think it's fair to say in recent months, what's happened is COVID-19 has accelerated these conversations and forced it to be a bit more front of mind. You'll see lots of companies at the minute. There aren't many organisations not impacted by this in terms of the workplace during COVID-19. Lots of focus on some of the practical, functional elements around how do you get people back into offices in a safe way following the government guidelines. Equally, how do you get people working effectively from home? But some of the stuff that not everybody maybe is as focused on as they might be are those implications and how it impacts how people feel about the organisation through those changes, how they feel about their role, and how it will indeed impact productivity and well-being.
Interesting. You mentioned about COVID accelerating, these discussions within the workplace, and I often wonder whether this positivity will continue. But can you explain, exactly what you mean about this acceleration that COVID has had, and how you think that might manifest itself for us going forward and the changes that we might be facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So home working, flexible working, agile working are all phrases which we've used an awful lot. And I think, a lot of organizations are making the considerations at the moment to what that's actually going to look at. If I just show you a couple of areas where through the conversations I've been having with our Interserve clients and customers, some of the things that are now being considered, I think you'll get a feeling for why I use that phrase about sort of acceleration and why it's really kind of creating that momentum. Occupation levels is obviously very important at the minute. Most of our customers and indeed ourselves are probably not occupying buildings in and beyond 30% at the moment. So lots of considerations about the functionality of the building and the restacking of people back into the workplace safely. Before sometimes it's about how many people can you get into a building as part of rationalization. Now it's more about how many people can you get in the building in a safe way where it allows them to do their jobs effectively. There's a lot of organizations at the minute that are developing their estate strategies, but most of that and some of that is around focusing on organizational effectiveness and indeed cost. So there's a piece around sort of rationalization in that. There's a piece around how can we work effectively as an organization based on who we are, what we are in our culture, in terms of how we best use our buildings going forward. So when we say effectiveness, it's about the organization's output, but equally it's about the employee engagement and the employee well-being as well. Reinductions, there aren't many organizations at the moment that either are not developing and considering their back to the office plan, or indeed making considerations for something that might not happen for a few months yet. But without a doubt, getting people back into the office is either a consideration for now or it's a consideration for how long will it be left and what needs to happen in the meantime. And that is about employees, but equally a lot of our organizations we work with have visitors and non-office based people coming to their sites. Lots of analysis and viewpoints and different sort of ways of enabling agile working is definitely on the table now. And fundamentally what organizations are typically looking at is around productivity and well-being. Now, in our work, we've been looking at workplace Interserve now for sort of three years, and although productivity and well-being are absolutely key, what we found is a building in its functional state does more than support productivity and employee well-being. The research we've done, which we'll touch on in a little while, it actually shows how the building supports how someone feels about the organization, and actually how they feel about their role and their purpose within that organization as well. So it's quite a complex sort of myriad of functions here.
So the question I would ask in around the productivity is how companies can actually measure that when people aren't in the office, and using some of the tools that we share with our customers, because obviously it's a very different scenario now.
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of organizations and most organizations measure productivity, and they measure it in different ways. There always tends to be output metrics within an organization. And one of the reasons we've developed the workplace methodology is to try and get a better handle on that, which is why we started to look at psychological contract fulfillment, because that helps us to understand, because it looks at an individual's output and how it's linked to an organization's output. What we try and do is understand how the building and the physical environment contributes to that. So therefore, it's not to say that you shouldn't have people moving away from the office into a home environment. It's to say that you need to understand how the building supports them today, or how the building supported them pre-COVID, and start to think about how you would replicate that and what that transition looks like. Because like we say, the building is not just doesn't have a functional purpose. When we explore in a little while some of the psychological contract fulfillment, you'll find that there's various elements of that which support how people feel towards the organisation and their role.
There's so much more than, you know, having a nice desk with a window and a good coffee machine and a canteen, isn't it? It's about that whole kind of feeling it gives you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, there's always this kind of conscious and subconscious element to all of this as well. You know, asking someone how they feel in a moment, and many people and many of the thought leadership you read and the surveys you read are all saying very positive things about how people feel about working from home. But the reality is, to some degree, is, you know, it's all quite short term at the minute. There's a bit of a novelty aspect to that. And how will that feel in deepest, darkest January, when there's not the opportunity to maybe sort of, you know, go for a walk in your lunch break and appreciate that? It's a very different environment. And I think what you find when you sort of do the diagnostic work we have done with the workplace methodology is truly trying to dig into some of that subconscious stuff about where that building and that environment, it's not just about the physical building, but that workspace and the people and everything that goes with it, how that does enable people to work more effectively. So there's lots to still be discovered, I think. So, and it's perfect segue to this point that the workspace is supporting employees both on a physical and emotional basis. And again, we'll touch on that in a moment. But, you know, any building and any working environment tends to impact on both, you know, it's a physical and a sensory aspect. And it's some of those sensory aspects I think people are struggling with to replicate at home as well, in terms of the workspace able to create themselves. And by sensory, we're talking about noise levels. So that would be the deliveries arriving during the day when you're on a you know, the Zoom call, your lighting, it's hydration, it's noise, it's smell. So all of that stuff contributes, and there's been a lot of research for that. I've touched on this a couple of times already, the role of, you know, how someone feels about their role and how someone feels about their employer. That does change depending on your working environment. And again, some of that, unfortunately, is you have to dig down into the subconscious a little bit. So it's not about the question, the overt question you ask in an employee engagement survey. Actually, we need to be a bit smarter about how we understand some of that. Big one at the moment, you can't read something on LinkedIn at the moment without talking about, you know, team working or collaboration, connectivity, and sort of inclusivity. So I think a lot of organizations are really looking into this at the moment. You know, we're sat here now, Claire, using Zoom. You know, at least we get to see each other, where typically we used to be in the same office together. But, you know, there is technology to support that. But it's understanding what level of dependencies individuals and an individual's role have on collaborative working. So if you do have people going back into the office space, what organizations are considering now is, do we actually have to restructure and repurpose that office? So when people, if they're in a a hybrid role of working from home and working in the office, when they do come into this office space, is there somewhere to be able to be collaborative, to have informal discussions, and even to have some of those more sort of sensitive telephone calls where they need to shut a door. So I think all of this is going on as well, because it's not just about saying X portion in the office and X portion are working from home. It's actually being able to adjust and be agile with the workspace to accommodate both.
Yeah, because I know for myself that the actual physical working in the office or not, it is not an issue. It is that emotional. It's those connections with people. It's those, actually, some of the stolen conversations that you have in corridors where you come up with really great ideas and innovation, and you know that side of things is certainly what I find that I miss, and I just don't think you can be quite as creative, you know, when you're apart maybe, but.
No, and it's right. You know, I think how many times have you walked past someone, it's just triggered something in your mind, thinking, oh, I knew I needed to speak to you about someone, you know, or something. And I do that when I walk past someone from IT all the time. I knew there's something I wanted to speak to you about, but you know, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think that the last one on this list, which we hear an awful lot about, is the whole attraction and retention piece, Claire. Because you know it's a working environment, and the workspace absolutely should represent and reflect the brand, and the values and the culture of that organization. So what you're able to create, if organizations are looking at this hybrid model now and considering more agile working, is how do you make sure you still support the brand and how you want colleagues and employees to feel about you. And so much of that is linked to connecting with the purpose.
And that culture is what drives an organisation. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love about Interserve, the culture, and how you develop that when you're all disconnected. It is so much harder, isn't it? When you're not in the office and, you know, sort of face-to-face time.
Absolutely.
Okay, interesting. Iain, there's loads of different things we're talking about here. And to me, it's clear that there's not sort of one size fits all cookie cutter approach, because every organisation might have different challenges, be it you know, agile working, collaboration space, or you know, whatever it might be. But how can we assist, or how are we assisting our customers through that process? And you know, if you look at any organisation, it's fairly standard that people and property are the two most expensive assets. So it's not surprising people are taking this opportunity, you know, this accelerated sort of positioning of where COVID's put us in, to actually review these things. You know, is there kind of an approach or some sort of glide path that we can use to support customers through this journey?
Yeah, I think that there is. Before we sort of talk about what Interserve have been doing with their customers, I guess you could look at something that's quite vanilla and linear when you look at this. And you know, right now we're talking about a trigger to evaluate, you know, property utilisation and occupation, and in some cases repurposing. There are multiple triggers where organisations will go through this process and have these considerations. You know, right now, in all honesty, that COVID-19 is the key one. And it tends to be, as organisations go through this process and their consideration, it tends to be these kind of 5 stages. And I guess we kind of want to focus on 2 to try and answer your question, Claire, and to try and sort of flesh out a bit more of what we talked about. It's this stage 1 and 2. And I would say most organisations are at stage 1 and 2 at the moment in their considerations, and some who maybe started the process a little bit earlier are into that stage 3, which is the transformation and, in essence, the delivery of the strategy. But just on the first 2 points, the main thing that organisations will be doing at the moment is to evaluate the property as it is, and understand how the building was used pre-COVID-19. And I think that's really important. I think the temptation is always that people move straight into developing a strategy, a building strategy, a workplace strategy. But fundamentally, if you're not clear on how the building was used pre-COVID and pre this kind of forced environment, it's very difficult to know what the implications would be of that strategy. So this early stage diagnostic, this data finding, is really important to either input into the strategy, or to validate the strategy, or to understand then the impact of delivering it and what that then means in reality to the workplace experience. And just to give you an example to bring that to life, in a piece of work we've done recently, a couple of things we found. One is that 25% of the occupants within the building were not based there. So 25% of the people who went through our diagnostic assessment actually go in there once a week because they're home-based or they're based in a different site. So that needs to be considered when looking at the future strategy, because you're not just looking at those people at desks prior to COVID and then reallocating them. You've got this other population as well. In the same survey, nearly 70% talked about how their role and how they benefit from the physical environment. So you'd want to ask the question, why and how? Because if you don't know that and you then start enforcing changes, you can't really understand or mitigate what the impact of that would be. Again, same survey, 50% were fixed desk. So they were very used to coming in every day, probably having a parking space, having a desk and working there. So there's 50% of people who will tend to use different parts of the building to do their job. 34% depended on collaboration as the key dependency to deliver their role and to be effective in their role. 34% said collaboration was absolutely key. We could go on. I could give you.
It's a big amount of people, though, right? That if you're not delivering that, it's
absolutely
you're not meeting your target.
Absolutely. You know, and the final thing I'd say is, again, I've mentioned this sort of psychological contracting. The things that happen for people which influence their productivity, but how they feel about the organisation they work for and their role. And these things are around process, payoff, purpose, and people. They're the 4 Ps, and this is tried and tested. It's not sort of new knowledge. But in this same assessment that we did, that building, those that worked in that building had an increase of 1 point deviation, which fundamentally enforces that those people based in that particular building, if that building continued to support them the way it was, they would have a higher level of productivity and output. So knowing that, you have to understand that before you can then develop a strategy to maybe change how that happens. It doesn't mean you wouldn't do it, but how do you replicate some of those things that the people in their roles in that building were benefiting from? So more than just a building, more than just a bricks and mortar.
One of the challenges that I'd put to you in around the point 1 there, the evaluating the current property function and the sort of aligning with organisation strategy, I would argue probably that even if people did have that, and even if they had a quick new strategy when COVID hit, it caught everyone by surprise, more or less, that people should be reassessing, reevaluating, because there was almost like this very quick, this is what we need to do, and it was just get everybody home, working from home. But actually, now's the time, rather than just assuming that's okay, because it's very short-term strategy, isn't it, that's in place at the moment. And a lot of this stuff, I personally think, needs to be reevaluated and looked at. And even if you are on step 2 or 3, maybe to circle back and have a look at the earlier stages as well.
I think you raise a great point, because anything like this probably has a robust business case, commercial case, and a people case sitting behind it. And as part of that, you would want to understand what your baseline is. How did people feel prior to? And to your point about informing short, medium, long-term strategies, I think what influences that strategy in the short term could be quite different to medium and long term. There's some short-term requirements right now in order for businesses to sort of get back to this normal. But there is a danger of developing a strategy without being sort of fully aware of how that building was utilised before. And that's where this kind of diagnostic piece comes in, and the workplace methodology that we've been developing. In terms of those that have the strategy, then the key bit there for me, and from the conversations I've been having, is around understanding then the impact of that strategy on people. And we've put in this slide about defining the workplace reality. A lot of companies at the minute, a lot of organizations are talking about this hybrid model, about rotating, having some people at home on a Monday, Tuesday, and on a Wednesday, Thursday, they'll come back into the office. And again, if you just look at the practical functional elements of that, you could say it's quite straightforward. You've got X amount of people, X amount of desks, and they'll share. But we all know the emotion that can be attached to some of this. You know when someone sat at your desk at work, right, when you've been on holiday and they've adjusted your seat. And the serious side of that, some people have certain desk setups and chair setups for health reasons. So, the workplace experience for those individuals could change by something that seems like a very functional, rational decision. There are, of course, positives to that, where all of a sudden maybe parking becomes more feasible when you haven't got the level of occupancy you had before. But those colleague journeys, the little bits that kind of make up the day, will be changed by the strategy. So I think it's important that organisations really understand the experiential implications of making some of those changes as well. And as far as 3, 4, and 5 are concerned here, I think they're quite sort of self-explanatory in terms of once you have that, it's about the transformation planning. We all know the importance of communications and engagement and not being done to and being involved. So that's really key there. The final point on this slide, the 5th point, Claire, is, as you say, about, you mentioned before, measuring productivity and measuring the benefits, being very, very clear on actually what was it you understood from stage 1, what was it you had baked into the strategy in stage 2, and can we therefore measure the benefit both in hard and soft metrics from the end of this. And of course that is a continual process.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've mentioned a few times the work that you and the team and customer experience have done with InServe clients as well. And I guess the key thing here we're talking about is the experience. Can you just explain to me, how the world of customer experience has kind of led into or supported this whole workplace experience and the tools that we're using now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess for a lot of this for us started in 2016. We did a piece of work with AWA, Advanced Workplace Associates, and that was really trying to understand about what was informing the workplace. This is all about the sort of the rise of the knowledge worker. Those people that do tend to be office based, they don't produce a product, but it is their intellect that creates their value for the organization. And through this work we did with them, what you started to find is that the same principles of customer experience about using insight, understanding the kind of the rational and the emotional needs of employees, and starting to look at that in kind of as an employee journey and breaking it down. And what's fundamentally key there, as with customer experience, is this stuff shouldn't be left to chance. It should be by design. And just like customer experience, you want colleagues to feel a certain way and behave a certain way, even if that's about driving the productivity and performance of your organization. This stuff has to be by design. So the principles between customer experience and workplace are very much the same. What I think you find more in workplace, which the science series brought out, was this aspect of sensory. So this whole thing around, noise, smell, sound, temperature. You don't get that so much within customer experience. It's more about understanding the specification of the customer. So sensory aspects are really, really key. That came through in this work we did with AWA. In terms of then that relationship with the more practical aspects, we've been doing customer experience in InServe now for 5 years. We've had the in-house team, and we work across the private and the public sector. So what we've got is even within InServe this wealth of experience, which we can then bring to the workplace, which has been applied in consumer worlds as well. But you can see from this slide some of the organizations that we've been doing this work with over the years, and some great things have been achieved with them. So it's a fantastic mix of that. There is the theory, but most importantly, there's this practical application and experience of practical application, which has enabled us to develop the workplace methodology, which is something that really will sort of set us apart.
I hope you found part one of our webinar interesting, and it's been very much around the process and the challenges that organisations are facing and some of the questions that are being raised. What we're going to look at in part two is very much the practical, the how. How are you going to use the tools that we can provide for you, or how do we work with our customers to actually implement and support them through these journeys? So if you'd like to reach out to us or want any more information, please feel free to contact either Iain or myself on the contact details below. There's also a link there to some of our thought leadership pieces on our website. And we hope to see you for part two of the webinar. Thank you.